Bud, I need your help.
Yeah. What we got?
Yeah, I need your help here. Because we get these reports with big words like college athletics leaders discussing revenue sharing and House antitrust settlement. And like, look, you've got the definitive explainer on YouTube about the NCAA versus House case. You are the expert in the industry on the case itself and sort of what it means for college athletics. And then I open all these stories. And look, I'm not throwing shade. Like Dennis Dodd has a story on this. Pete Thamel has a story on this. Ross Dellinger has a story on this. The most important figures in the future of college athletics are thinking about different models for the future that would include revenue sharing as part of trying to settle a lawsuit that if the NCAA and the Power Conference loses could total $4 billion in losses. But then I open up the stories and they're like, but many hurdles remain. Details are murky, like still the early stages, obstacles ahead. So like, but what's your sense of what they are trying to do and what seems possible to be able to navigate this lawsuit and in doing so kind of set up the format for the future of college athletics?
Sure. So the lawsuit is the House case. House
Right.
against NCAA. House was a swimmer at Arizona State. We did an 8-minute video because you got to go 8 minutes on YouTube to monetize things. And you should check it out on our channel. I think it's probably like the best short form explainer that we can do on this. Trying to be even shorter about it. They're suing for back NIL because now NIL has been recognized as sort of a right. They have a pretty good case. They got it in front of the judge who also blasted the NCAA the last 2 times that she had an NCAA type case in front of her. And she doesn't seem to play a lot of these kind of nonsense circular argument that the NCAA sometimes gets away with at lower levels of court. So anyway, one of the things that the plaintiffs are asking for, in addition to the back NIL, is a new revenue sharing plan going forward. And Jeffrey Kessler, who is the plaintiff's attorney here, he also sued the NFL and a couple other famous suits. He's basically said it's unlikely that we would settle without also fixing that issue or making progress towards that issue. So I know Dennis Dodd has reported a lot on this. There's kind of some talk that they could have a $20 million settlement for back NIL. That does not really fix your antitrust issues and other antitrust cases going on. I think that the ultimate play here is it's very clear the NCAA and its member schools want an antitrust exemption from Congress. Should they get one? I don't think so. At least, certainly not yet. And from Congress's standpoint, A, I doubt they're going to do anything fast because it's an election year. But B, nobody in Congress can sit there and say, hey, these guys have tried something, right? And it hasn't worked. We need to help them out. This would actually be an affirmative step forward. Like, look, we are trying some things. We need you to kind of get the to get the ball across the goal line here, so to speak, to use the football analogy. If you agree to this and you all of a sudden you have revenue sharing and you end up getting some kind of collective bargaining, is that enough to get an antitrust exemption out of Congress? Is that enough to get a declaration from Congress that these guys are not employees? I'm very skeptical on the latter. Like all of these sort of pseudo revenue sharing type models. Like I saw one, I think Dellinger tweeted out, he was like, all right, so it's going to be in-house NIL and require the players to play in games. Like, you know what that looks a lot like? Employee status. Like literally.
Like play.
It's NIL, but it's conditioned on you playing in the games, and it's run in-house by the people who run the team for which you're playing, but you're not an employee. Anyway, I'm very skeptical about that. I'm very skeptical they can enforce these kids to play in bowl games. The playoff, maybe you have leverage to get guys to agree to do so. Bowl games, almost certainly not. But that's kind of where we are with this, right? I do think we will get to a revenue sharing model at some point. I know the 15 to 20 million has been thrown out there. I don't think you can enforce any kind of cap on it really without collective bargaining. And if you did, I think NIL will still exist for to a certain extent, because we had NIL before we had NIL, right? Certain schools had 1 million Chargers and Corvettes in the parking lot long before we ever had NIL even addresses the term. So that's kind of where we are. I think a lot of this is, we know there's a likelihood that we get smoked if we don't settle it. If we do settle it and settle it quickly, it allows us to show Congress that we're at least trying, and maybe our Hail Mary has a better chance of being caught if we've shown and taken some affirmative steps to do so.
Yeah, I was surprised at, most people I think it's going to take place, like it's going to get resolved in the next 12 to 15 months, like sooner rather than later, that we could see this system put in place. Like the settlement's made, it's bam. I think there's so much at stake. Not one of these lawsuits, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Bud, have given the NCAA any sort of hope that they're going to win. Like everything has been against them, like every suit. So they have every incentive to settle. I just think it's going to come down to, can they work out a deal where Kessler and his crew are like, okay, like that seems reasonable. And I'm sure that's what they're talking about now, is the numbers and negotiating them and figuring out what's fair. Couple things I thought were interesting. The 15 to 20 million number, that was pretty interesting. And I thought it was also of note that Trev Alberts, when he was at Texas A&M, he alluded like they're keeping aside 15 to 20 as they're like denoting that as a part of their future budgets moving forward.
And then those layoffs.
Yeah. And that was a part of why he laid out, 22 staffers, like, pretty long-term staffers in the athletic department to try to do that. So I thought that was interesting. I did ask Dan Murphy, who wrote the piece for ESPN along with Thamel. I said, how do they get around the employee thing? Like, because that to me is what they want to avoid at all costs. And he was saying he thinks, could they do it where they pay them as independent contractors? Does that avoid that?
It's possible, but the independent contractor status, there's a certain amount of control that you can and cannot exercise.
Right.
So a lot of the stuff I've looked at looks a lot like an employee status.
Right.
I think that it's totally fine to throw out there a proposal that looks a lot like employee status and try to call them contractors. And what's the downside? That they end up being employees? Okay, at least you tried. But if you want the contractor status, the amount of control that you're able to exercise is reduced.
Yeah, contractor doesn't fix the portal.
Correct.
Like if you're thinking that the revenue sharing model is going to calm down what happens when the transfer portal opens, no, because you're not going to be able to, just like a lot of independent contractors, right? This, again, I'm guessing here, but doesn't that seem correct?
Yes. In some cases, I do think that whatever they have will largely fix the transfer portal issue as far as people have with it. And that's a good thing to me. I don't think it's good to have players transfer schools every semester. Like, I think it's good that you have the right to do so, but I don't know that you should always exercise that right,
Yeah. So Danny, you mentioned 12 to 15 months. The reason for the urgency is this thing is set to go to like court January 2025. So if it gets to court and they lose, I like
$4 billion. $4 billion was the number.
And it was like, so can they figure out a way to settle for $1 billion, which is still like but avoid $4 billion? Like that's kind of the proposal. And then as Bud mentioned, can you create a format, because Jeffrey Kessler has other active lawsuits, that are ongoing right now. Can you get into a world where some of those other legal cases end up falling by the wayside as well? So it was one of those stories that I understand why it's happening. It's so hard for me to wrap my head around it because I just want to fast forward to the end. And I know that's
same. I'm in the same exact place. I hate all this talk. I just want to talk ball.
Yeah.
And yet, like the one thought that I had when I heard about the number 15 to 20 million, I said, well, what percentage of revenue is that? Because, most professional sports, those athletes split about 50-50. And this is only like 10 to 15% of the split. So like, is that the next argument that we're going to be having? Or even once they come up with a new model and they figure out a way to pay them, then those athletes who are represented by a union and have lawyers are going to come in and say, well, wait a second. I don't know, 15 to 20% of revenues. That doesn't seem right. And then we're going to be right back to arguing. And are we going to have holdouts like strikes and players, seasons lost potentially? Like all this stuff just makes my mind want to explode.
I mean, look, the 15 to 20 million cap is flatly illegal if you don't have collective bargaining.
Right.
Because that is entities colluding to not pay people. Like literally, you guys get sued over this all the time and you keep losing. So that's why you have to get to the collective bargaining stage. If it's collectively bargained and the union doesn't like it, tough,
Right.
tough, right? Like, okay, you know, you can fix that the next negotiation.
And then how do you negotiate with college athletes that are going to be gone in 4 years? Like, what does it look like trying to get that union all on the same page? Whew. Wild stuff.